So now that we've had CNI, the Calico CNI, take the pod, build a virtual Ethernet between the pod's network namespace and the underlying host, and assign it an IP address. Now let's talk about the next stage and how Calico is actually going to make the networking work for that pod. So again, we're going to start off with the host over here. Make it a little smaller this time. Oh, I can't draw squares. That's fine. I'm not an artist. I'm an engineer. All right. So I then have, again, this boundary layer that we talked about before between the host kernel and the workload. I have my pod up here. And I'm going to put another pod up here too. That's going to explain this a little better when we get going. And I'm going to say this is pod address A1, and this one is pod address A2. And I'm going to have down here in the kernel, I'll stay with the green, I'm going to have the networking engine down here, standard kernel networking, and I'm going to represent that routing table now just as literally a table. So I'm going to have a routing table entry, and that routing table entry is going to have addresses and what's called next hops. And what that routing table is basically going to say, if something is destined to a given address, where should the kernel routing engine, the kernel networking engine in Linux or Windows, send that traffic? So that's what that table is. So this is the routing table here. And if you remember, we had a couple of Ethernets here, virtual Ethernets. So we'll call this virtual Ethernet 1 and virtual Ethernet 2. And I've got my kubelet down here. The kubelet really doesn't come into play here anymore, but I'll leave it here. So the kubelet. And I've got Kubernetes here. The rest of the Kubernetes infrastructure. And the kubelet is talking to that. And I have the CNI plugin. Again, that's not really going to come into play anymore here. CNI is sending traffic that way. The kubelet's talking back and forth to Kubernetes, and the kubelet is talking to the CNI plugin. Now there's a couple of new things that we're going to introduce to the puzzle. And these are the things, these are going to be different depending on what the networking plugin is. So Calico's mechanics here are going to be different than some of the other networking plugins that might exist out there, like Flannel or Weave or any of the others that exist. We're going to be talking about Calico here as an example. So Calico has a pod that it runs in the host namespace, which is called the Calico node. And Calico node has two components in it. Calico node has a Felix and it has another pod. We'll talk about another workload. We'll talk about that in a minute. Right now it's got Felix. So Felix is talking to the Calico key value store. Now that might be an actual standalone store. More likely today, we see this as most people are deploying this where the Calico key value store is actually using the Kubernetes API server as the store. So in reality, Felix is talking to the Kubernetes API server, and the Calico, the data it's going for, the Calico key value pairs are stored in that Kubernetes API server. So it might be talking to something that's standalone, like etcd, that's a standalone instance, or it's talking to the Kubernetes API server. But it's basically, either way, it's getting some data. Let's talk about what's stored here really quickly. In these key value stores, there's three things that are stored here. One is configuration. And this is things like IP address ranges to use. We call those pools. NAT settings, BGP, which we'll talk about in a little bit, settings, etc. So configuration is one thing that's stored. The other is inventory. And inventory is the pods, their IP addresses, locations, and labels. Metadata that Kubernetes is attached to those pods. And again, we'll talk about those when we get to network policy. And the last thing is intent. And I'm going to leave intent a black box for right now, and I wrote that too high, so I'll just put it right here. Intent. But we'll fill out the intent box later. So what Felix is going to be interested in is this right now, is this inventory piece. So Felix watches the key value store for updates to, again, just like the kubelet is only paying attention to things that Kubernetes wants it to do on its given host. The same thing, Felix is only responsible for networking on that particular host or that particular server. So in this case, Felix is watching for updates. Felix on host 1 is watching for updates about inventory on host 1. Felix on host 2 is looking for updates to inventory on host 2, etc., etc. So in this case, this Felix is going to find out that we have networked two pods on that host, on its host, A1